Hi, this is Attorney Broderick Brown with FightSlumlords.com. I want to talk today about what a potential settlement agreement may be between Deshaun Watson and the alleged victims. So in today's video, I'm going to go over what some of the terms would include, and then I'll go over what I believe the settlement amounts may be. Let's start at the beginning. So any settlement agreement that Deshaun Watson enters into with any of the alleged victims is going to include a confidentiality clause, and it's also going to include a non-disparagement clause. A confidentiality clause, on paper at least, prevents any of the victims from discussing the facts or the terms of the settlement and the facts of the case with the public or anyone else in the world unless they're compelled to do so by court. A non-disparagement is basically any of the victims can't say anything bad about Deshaun Watson. I would assume that there would be penalty provisions in the settlement agreements, so that if one of the plaintiffs were to say something in public about Deshaun Watson, they would have to pay a penalty. And some of this is just at least on paper, because we've seen in other cases in the news where plaintiffs, and by plaintiff I'm talking about the person that filed the lawsuit against the defendant in a civil matter, where the plaintiffs have spoken out about terms of lawsuits despite the fact that there was a confidentiality or a non-disclosure agreement in place. Because a lot of times the plaintiff may be judgment proof, or they may not have enough resources where it's worthwhile for the defendant to come after them if they breach the confidentiality agreement. But any settlement agreement in this case is going to include that. That's just standard. And so the question is, another question is how much do I think that the settlements will go for? And I would say that there appears to be two types of cases in this batch of 20 or so. I believe a couple of the plaintiffs are alleging that Mr. Watson forced them to perform sexual acts on him. And so those cases are different than the exposure cases, where they're alleging that Mr. Watson exposed himself to them. Let's discuss the exposure cases first. We know from Tony Busby's emails that initially he was demanding $100,000, and Mr. Watson's either attorneys or agents or Mr. Watson himself declined to make a counteroffer. Generally speaking, again, when a plaintiff's attorney offers $100 to start, that may mean $50, that may mean $75, but it definitely means less than $100, because the insurance company or defendant is never going to pay your first offer, generally speaking. And so I would assume that Mr. Busby would probably have settled the case for $50,000. And I think that given that he's got 20 other cases that are similar, that I think that the settlement value of the cases have gone up. Because now I think Mr. Watson would be a lot more motivated to settle the case. At the same time, we're talking about single incidences, or one single incident, and so a hypothetical jury is only going to award so much. I don't believe that this is a six-figure case. I don't see a reasonable jury awarding six figures. Now, on Mr. Busby's best day, they may get six figures. But like I typically tell my clients, that you can't go, I use a baseball analogy, you can't go to trial assuming you're going to do your best, that you're going to have your best day, that you're going to hit a walk-off home run or a grand slam. The reality of the time is that you're probably going to hit a ground ball to the shortstop, or a ground ball to the second baseman, or are you going to fly out to the right fielder or the left fielder? And what is that case worth? So not your best day, not your worst day, but just the middle, right? And for any of you that watched The Wire, they described it as a 40-degree day. In Baltimore, no one's worried about a 40-degree day. If it's a 60-degree day, people are out barbecuing. If it's a 20-degree day, people are out complaining. But a 40-degree day is just another day. And so if you just have another day in trial, I don't believe this is a six-figure case. But that said, the plaintiffs may be posturing for six figures because of the amount of leverage that they do have right now over Mr. Watson as the lawsuits currently sit. So if I was advising Mr. Watson, I would tell him to pay up to $100,000 to settle the case and then to be done with it. The advantage is that we know that he made $29 million last year, right? And if he paid each victim $100,000, that's only a fraction of his take-home pay after taxes. And it would, if he settled all these cases, it would force the NFL's hand to put him back on the field and at some point in 2021, but for sure in 2022 when he's set to make $35 million guaranteed. So his goal of it should be wrapping this all up so that he can be back on the field making $35 million in 2022. Because even if he settles the cases, there may be a possibility that the NFL still suspends him for a portion of 2021 or the entirety of 2021, right? And so if he has to pay, $50,000 to $100,000 for the exposure cases, ultimately that's good business because he may be able to make that back this year. Now, for the cases where the victims are alleging that he forced them to perform sexual acts on him, I think that's a whole different ballgame because potentially the criminal repercussions in those cases, and by criminal repercussions, I believe that if the discovery process goes through in the civil matter, meaning they take his deposition involved regarding those two or three incidents, they get the data from Instagram, they see if there's any DNA evidence that any of the plaintiffs may have, that ultimately the district attorney may file charges on those cases. And I don't know, and I can't speak to Texas, but a lot of states don't have statute of limitations for sexual assaults. And so it makes no sense for him to testify under the penalty of perjury as to what happened in those two or three incidents, because that could be used against him tomorrow, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, whatever, especially if there's no statute of limitations in the state of Texas. I think for those couple of cases, he's going to have to pay a premium. Because if I was advising him, there's no reason for him to sit and give testimony under oath, which may be used against him in a criminal proceeding. And the worst case scenario would be he says something to incriminate himself in a deposition, which is used to have sexual assault charges filed against him. And those sexual assault penalties in Texas are double-digit years. So, Mr. Watson made $29 million last year. If he's got to pay $500,000 or $1 million or a couple $1 million to make this go away so his freedom is not at risk, I think it's good business for him to do that. Now, whether or not he does that is something completely different. For the plaintiff's perspective is that they can go through the litigation, they can get the best jury in the world, the jury can think that Mr. Watson exposed himself, and they can say, like, well, that's true, we think it's worth $30,000, or we think it's worth $20,000. And so if you go through that process and you only get $20,000 or $30,000, that's a win for Mr. Watson. So that settlement for all parties involved will allow every party to take part in the final chapter of the litigation. And in my mind, it makes sense for all parties involved to settle this case. We know Mr. Watson has the funds, and for the plaintiffs, it's like, how much is it worth to have someone expose themselves to you? He might have exposed himself to them for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. It's traumatic, but what is that worth? And so that's the big question. There's a lot of variability, and it would really depend on who you get on your jury. And so ultimately, I think this case is going to probably settle. I think it should be settling. It should have settled yesterday. It should have settled today. It should settle sooner rather than later. But that's in terms of my valuation. And the foundation of that valuation are the emails we saw from Tony Busby, at least how he initially evaluated the first victim's claim. And those are my thoughts. I know one of the commenters told me I should do one of these videos, and he was right about the settlement language and the terms. But if you have comments, comment in the comment section below. Feel free to like the video and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to give you guys more content, but those are my thoughts on the potential settlement. And you know, in my practice, when I talk to my clients, generally I let them know that, like, you can have the jury with you on the liability, but everybody's got a different dollar amount. Like, everybody values the dollar differently. Someone who makes $50,000 is going to value the dollar differently than someone who makes $350 a year. And so you don't know who's going to be on your jury. You don't know how they're going to feel, and it's a risk for both sides. So ultimately, I expect this case to settle, but we're going to be following this case as it proceeds. If you guys have any requests for any content that you want me to give my opinion on, again, comment below. Thank you so much.